This is the shoe that we'll be making from this video. It has a center seam and it also is all tucked in. It looks like it is a lasted shoe. And one of the things that's really special about center seam shoes is that there's never any part where you have to gather the leather to make it fit around the toe and heel, because the distance around the upper is exactly the same as the distance around the sole. My patterns for this cinch top are on my website. First, you need to determine which size set of patterns to use to make your center seam shoes. To do that, stand with your foot against a wall on a piece of paper. So I'm trying to simulate that here by putting this cutting board up as a wall. The paper is directly against the wall and the heel is back against the wall. Of course, there's really, when you see the part that actually touches the ground, it's a good 1/4 inch away from the wall. So that means that when you stand against the wall like this and then make a mark at the end of the longest toe, you are actually adding about a 1/4 inch to that distance. So that gives you a little toe room. But if you want a little more, you can add 1/8 to a 1/4 inch to that length. I strongly suggest that you make a mock-up out of felt. Then you will know for sure which size pattern to use. So I have this distance here, and it looks like 10.5 inches. So I look at my sole patterns, the 6, and it's the inner line that I'm looking at. The 6 is 9.5, the 7 is 10, 8 is 10.25, and 9 is 10.5. So I would make my mock-up in size 9 out of felt with a thin cardboard sole. I drew around the patterns onto the felt and then cut the felt out with scissors, and then I copied the stitch marks that I had punched in the patterns. So I have those on both the outside and the inside of the shoe. So I'll make a mock-up now, and I'll use this pattern that's made out of thin, kind of rigid cardboard, has holes punched in it, and then I'll be able to try it on. I'm ready to stitch the 2 pieces of the upper together, and I'll do that in the same order in which we will make the actual shoe. That is, I'm first going to stitch the heel seam, and then I'll stitch the outside of the shoe to the sole, and then the inside, and the last thing that I will stitch will be the toe seam. So I'll start here with the heel seam, and you don't even really have to make stitch marks here. Just do a whip stitch up the heel. I'm using 1 strand from a spool of artificial sinew. It's really nice to have a spool of this so that you can take strands out of it and have the right thickness that you want. And I have a needle that's pointed at the end, which you use for felt, but not for stitching leather. So I'll keep going until I get to the top of the heel. I've whip stitched the heel seam, and now I'll take the thread around the needle a couple of times, pull it close to the felt and make a knot here, cut it off, and then I will be stitching the outside of the upper to the outside of the sole. So now I'm going to the first stitch mark here to the outside of the heel seam, and I'm going in that first hole to the outside of the mark that indicates the center of the heel seam. I'm going to then So I go through the inside of the upper, the top side of the sole, and then the next stitch will come through the bottom of the sole and then up through this next stitch mark, so that I'm turning this edge to the inside. And I'll keep on going till I get to the toe. I've made it up to the toe, and now I'll put my new thread on and start stitching again from back at the heel. Back to that first stitch mark on the inside of the foot, on the upper. So I go into that, then to the first hole on the inside of the center of the heel mark. So now I'll be tucking in this direction. So I'll be back when I have this stitching finished. I'm now approaching the end of stitching the inside. The stitches are closer together in this area of the toe so that you can make a smoother line. But I do my last stitch here from the underside up into this one, get it tucked in, and make my knot here, and then finish the mock-up by stitching this toe seam. The mock-up fit me fine, so I'm going to make myself a pair of center seams using the same patterns that I used for the mock-up. I'm using this leather, which is in my favorite color. It's so much my favorite color that I've already made myself a pair of chukka boots from it, and a pair of slip-on sandals, and a pair of earrings. So with the very last bits of it, I'm making this pair of shoes. It's so much the last bit that I had to piece two pieces together, you see here. So this will be on the inside of the shoe, on the left foot. I've made the patterns with the places where the stitches go punched out. And so I've punched the heel seam, the bottom edge, and the toe seam on the outside pattern. Well, this is the left foot, so I flip it over. And you might notice that I didn't put the heel stitch marks and the toe stitch marks on the inside pattern. And that is to make sure that they're exactly the same. This outside pattern on the inside and the toe seam stitches will be directly across from each other. To make sure that I punch the holes an equal distance from the edge, I'm using this wing divider and kind of blurring my punches a little, kind of blurring my stitch holes a bit, but I can still see where they belong. I'll do the heel. In all of these, we want the stitches pretty close to the edge. I'd say about 3/16 of an inch. So using the drive punches, this is the 0-0 punch, very common one to use. And so I have this block of hardwood underneath. So I can just go along here on the line and punch them out with this. You can also get punches that are smaller. This is a 0-0-0 punch. The problem is that the little tiny pieces that you punch can easily get stuck there in that tiny tube. And you might prefer making slits. I like slits, especially for any stitching that's on the upper of the shoe, except when I go around corners, I always put a round one, but here I'll take this single slit punch. It's much easier to make slits, and you don't remove any piece of the shoe. It also comes in sets of 4 like this. If I were going to put some embellishment along the top edge of the shoe, I would use this, and I'd draw that line with the wing divider first. And I would punch out 4 at a time, and then from now on I'll punch out 3 at a time, because I put the first prong of the punch into the last slit that was made, so that they're all equally distant from each other. And I am going to stitch the top edge, so I'm a little bit ahead now. And then hand punches. This is a 0-0 hand punch, and it's nice because you can change this tube here if it gets clogged up. So one thing to make sure you do is put another piece of leather below when you are using a hand punch like this, because you want that tube to go all the way through the top layer. So I usually put my thumb there to give myself a little more pressure. And then here's a 0-0-0 hand punch, which is nice, but these punches can't go very far towards the center of your project, so you need to think of that when you get started. Here I've made a tiny little hole. Since this leather that I'm using is a little thicker than what is ideal for making a stitch in, I'm going to skive a little bit, which means to make it thinner here at the bottom edge. So I have this tool called a skiver. Of course, it's much better if you have knife skills and can sharpen a knife and do this work. I don't have those skills, so this has a single edge razor blade, but it's a special kind that you have to get, and I think Tandy's is one of the best sources, that you put into this tool and then just cut as you go along. Too much pressure, and of course you'll cut into your leather. Too little pressure, and you won't be able to fold the edge under so easily. But this is a nice fresh blade. I'm cutting on a piece of safety glass from a junked car, so that's a good foundation for this kind of skiving. It's nice to have some extra support at the heel. There's 2 ways that you can provide this support. One is to put a vegetable tanned piece of leather the inside of the heel, then punch stitching holes through this. I used a piece of double-sided tape. If it's too thick right here to turn under, you have a really hard time making this shoe work. So the best thing to do is to make it as long as the upper pattern is, but to skive that bottom edge. I took off those inside heel support pieces because I want to have a colorful heel cover on my shoe. So I am using this gel pen that hopefully will work till I've made it around this pattern piece. I added just a little pull up at the top of the heel cover, and then I'll cut this out with scissors and do a little stitching on this V shape. I have my heel cover ready to be stitched in this little V section here, which makes the heel cover fit much better. So I'm going across at the top, and then I can even out the threads. Then I'm going to make the cross stitch, and I go into the next hole on the other side and then straight across. So that's one leg of the cross stitch, and then do the same with the other thread. Go across and then right up across from that, and then give a good tug so the X's are nice and tight, and then keep on going down to the next set of holes and up, and the next and up. So I'll be back shortly after I finish this. Since I'm adding the heel cover to the outside of the shoe, I'm going to stitch the heel seam before it's in place. I cut a piece of thread about 8 times the length that I'll be stitching, went through a couple of stitches at the top, and then evened out the threads so they're the same length. Put a needle on both ends. So I'm going through this next hole on the opposite side with this needle and coming right back up through the hole across from it. I'm using main thread at 2.0. It is my very favorite stitching thread. It comes in the 2.0 is very thin. It's waxed and braided, and they also have it in gradually thicker sizes like 0.3 and 0.4. So you can get just the right thickness. And this does not, when you put a second needle into a hole, it doesn't split the thread that's already in there. And that is so helpful when you're stitching. So I love main thread, plus it's a nice little local business in Lewiston, Maine. And they sell needles that exactly match the thread, so it really sets you up well for stitching, and they have some lovely colors. So I made the diagonal with one thread, and now I'm going in the opposite direction with the other one. So I've made one part of the cross stitch, and now I'll take the other thread and go in the same hole that the first thread came out of, and then go across into this same hole directly across from it, and I'll pull on these threads together so that they make a nice tight little X here. I've stitched this seam and made a square knot here at the bottom, and taking my threads up under a couple of stitches So now I turn this over and I'm going to add my heel support piece. There are a couple of ways in which you can attach the heel cover to the body of the shoe. One is to look on the patterns, and the patterns show you where the stitch marks go all around the heel cover, and there are also stitch marks that I've copied onto the upper here. So you can line this up and start stitching using the 2-needle running stitch. But first I want to show you that it's very helpful if you can fasten the end of your thread to your needle. But this thread from main thread, this wax braided thread, is so tightly braided that you can barely get a needle in between some of the strands. So first I go about a half an inch or so away from the end and then just hammer it so that the thread is flat. I even had to use a push pin first after hammering it to get it separated enough so that I could get my thread opened up and the end of the needle pushed through. And then you just pull the needle all the way through, and now your needle won't come off as you're stitching. So I'll start here and in this hole and come up through the next one, and then through the hole in the cover. Now I've almost made a stitch, but I'm going to even out the lengths of thread. Okay, so it's just like you're doing a running stitch, in and out and in and out, but you've got 2 threads that are going in and out at the same time. So this thread just came up. So with this one, I'm going to go down through that same hole. And now I've made a stitch. So I'm going to pull on both threads to seat that stitch, and then I'll keep repeating this pattern. So I'm going in with the thread that's on top, kind of pull it over to the side. That's one of the reasons why I like to make slits instead of holes, because you can put 2 threads side by side into a slit. So I'll keep going across the top, down, and then across the bottom, so that I will have a thinner piece of leather by itself to turn under when I'm stitching in. So now I turn this over and I'm going to add my heel support piece. I have tape on my heel cover, and now I want to make sure this is lined up right along the heel seam. I'm starting right above the stitch holes along the bottom seam. I made a mark here so I would be lined up with the heel seam at the top as well as the bottom. Next, I will punch stitch holes all around this piece. So I've used this wing divider to make a little line to show me where to put these stitch holes, or I'm going to use slit maker around these edges. So I'll start here. Usually I like to make a round hole at the corners because when I'm making slits. The slits don't look very good at the corners. Fortunately, I also have a single slit punch, so it looks like I will be using that I think I'm going to just go in the center here. So I'll go all around the edge of this, making these slits. I've got all my slits made. Whoops, gotta make them there. And I'll do those, and then I will be stitching around the edge of this heel cover. And now to stitch the upper to the sole. And I like to use thread that matches the sole, since that's where the only place where it would be visible. So I'm using this bowling sole. So I'm starting at the heel. I'm going to stitch the inside of this left foot sole first. Being right-handed, I like to start out in this direction. And then I'm taking this thread through that first hole to the inside of the center of the heel. And then I'll bring that thread back up. Now I'll even out the lengths of my thread and go on to the next hole in the upper. So now I have a thread going down from the upper through that next hole, and there's a thread in the next hole that's going to go up into the hole I just left. So I'm taking this on down, trying not to split the thread that's there, holding it over to the side. And I'm about halfway to the toe. So I'm continuing to go down through the upper and the sole, and then up through the sole and the upper. And then give a really strong tug. So I'll continue, then be back. And you notice that in the toe area, there are 3 extra stitch holes so that you can make a nice curve around here with your upper. As you stitch around this toe area, you continually curl this edge under, and you might need to poke it. You better have an awl handy for this work. So I've got one more stitch to go. I'm pulling really hard here to keep that curl going. And then I'll take one more stitch and I will be there to the center. I'm back at the heel, ready to stitch the outside of the shoe. And so I put my thread, which is 5 times the length of the sole, with the needle at each end. I brought the thread through that first hole in the sole and the upper, and I'll do the same stitch. The stitch that came up now needs to go into the next hole. And then down in the next, in the sole. So I've got my first stitch done. I'll bring this thread up and in that second hole, so now I have a good stitch here, and I'm going to pull on both threads with as much force as I can. And I have that first stitch anchored there. And so I'll go into the next stitch hole. And down into the sole. And then the thread that's left behind, I'll bring it up through the sole and the upper. So I'll continue with this until I get to the toe on the other side. So you can see I've got a couple of stitches now, and I'll continue. I've made it to the top of the toe seam. I'm going to do a double square knot, which means I've got right over left, and do that again, right over left. And pull, get it squared away, and then left over right 2 times. Left over right and left over right. Squared up, and it makes a nice little knot. With these ends, you can either burn them close to the knot, or take the ends and weave them under either the toe seam, weave them under a couple of threads, or if you stitch the top line, you can thread it under a few stitches and then clip off the threads. And once you've made this knot, your shoe is complete. Here's my favorite way to stitch along the top line. I'm starting with just one needle, going in this top hole on the heel seam, leaving a tail that I will make a knot with when I get back again after completing the stitching. And so I went around twice in that hole so it would hold. And what I'm going to do is go into the next slit, and then that makes a diagonal stitch, and then I'm going back in that same hole and I'm making an upright stitch. So diagonal, and then back in that same hole. So that's what I keep doing. It makes little, kind of like little V shapes. And that's it.